How far would you go to uncover the truth? How deep would you dig? This is a tale of two men, a father and son cursed by seductive curiosity who each pushed a little too far. Howard Laforet, a man of learning who forsook family in pursuit of unearthly knowledge, and Philip Buchanan, who chased the shadow of his father to the ends of the earth, where something ancient and eldritch and unfathomable stirred. After a long, harrowing route through a maze of minds, the son finds himself at the doorstep of closure, answers teasing, beckoning him further. Yet behind that door is an inheritance never intended to be passed down. Behind that door are the sins of the father, and it will take a profound sacrifice to make those sins right. Struck down by an unknown assailant, Philip awakens to find himself trapped in the ruinous remains of a research facility. Pained wails and feral snarls echo behind locked doors. Whitecoats lie dead on the linoleum, and a chalkboard demands that the unpure be kept out. Something has gone terribly awry. The facility is now a charnel house. In the previous episode, we discussed how a viral outbreak of some kind had breached the quarantine and made its way into the northwestern mine. In order to understand the nature behind this blight, we must first examine the shelter, or more specifically, the powers behind it. Rather surprisingly, this will require us to turn the hands of time back a few centuries. In 1519, Francesco Melzi, a Milanese noble, founded a movement dedicated to the private work of his teacher, Leonardo da Vinci. A polymath of extraordinary vision, the Florentine not only excelled with the brush and chisel, but also envisioned contraptions many centuries ahead of his time. Flying machines, armored tanks, the parachute and solar power, to name but a few. While considered impractical at the time, Da Vinci's designs were limited by the means of production of the 1400s, which Melzi and his successors understood. They also understood the power of a name to identify and tie down its owner, which is why the foundation remained unnamed for hundreds of years. The moniker, Archaic, which they eventually became known by, isn't even an official term, just a bit of shorthand tossed around by lower members of their caste. The Foundation's goal is a bit of a mess, as the Archaic note contradicts itself. It asserts that as the Archaic transitioned into the 21st century, their role remained unchanged, to locate, understand, and protect xeno-evidence and life forms, despite never once mentioning anything of the sort. One moment, the Foundation is about Da Vinci's engineering work, the next, aliens. Whether this be an oversight or intentional is a mystery, though it ultimately doesn't matter. In the intervening years, the Archaic has maintained secrecy and grown to over 30,000 members at 203 installations worldwide. The installation that is of interest to us is, of course, the shelter. As covered in the previous episode, construction began in 1973, after the Archaic had caught wind of supernatural happenings in the northwestern mines. It was commissioned by the Archaic Central Caste and was populated by personnel representing the various hierarchies of the caste, which is divided into 5 distinct ranks. The hierarchy of the Archaic is as follows. At the top is the Central Caste, who are the authority and absolute power behind the organization. Despite this, they actually aren't privileged to confidential information. Howard makes note that the shelter's security level is high enough that no trace of it exists beyond the confines of these walls. Not even the Archaic Central Caste have records of its location. This is because the elevated caste, the second highest rank, can conceal any projects from them if they believe the Central Caste's involvement to be disruptive. Next are the chief staff, essentially middle management, overseeing key projects while still being beholden to the elevated and their superiors. Below them are the lower caste, the general rank-and-file personnel assigned to a project. Lastly, the temporary, whose members pass through a revolving door of project reassignment. In 1975, construction of the shelter is completed. Of all the personnel working at the nascent facility, the most notable is Howard Laforet, a master linguist whose eye for language will one day, 30 years from now, spell doom for him and anyone else whose thirst for knowledge won't be sated by contentment alone. While we know little about him as a person, it's safe to say he isn't exactly a paradigm of decency. After all, Howard trades his wife and unborn son for moldy tomes and scientific curiosity. Yet, he is a great intellect. His contribution to the Archaic's work sees him translating ancient texts and unearthing strange artifacts. Whether Howard's research has anything to do with the discovery of the persona TARDIS isn't specified, but considering his voice is among the legion Philip hears when touching these curious little relics, it's almost a certainty. To say work at the shelter was sensitive would be an understatement. To say it's dangerous is only apparent in hindsight. Howard will one day learn this the hard way. However, foresight need only a cautious mind, which is why at some point in time, Howard locks away copies of his research in a safety deposit box in Mayfair, London. On March 3rd of the year 2000, the primary excavation team uncovers something xenological nestled deep within a womb of ice and rock. Howard's work proves invaluable in the eventual discovery of this Pandora's box, this tomb. However, unlike foolhardy Epimetheus, Howard exercises caution before popping the cork. He protests all further excavation of the tomb until we can fully translate the texts. Howard sees the potential risks. He warns his superiors, which in this case is Chief Overseer Wilbur Frisk, who will not heed the warning. Fearful of what's to follow, he decides to reach out to the only person he believes he can trust, his son, Philip. This we covered in the previous episode, so we need not discuss it any further here. Considering the severity of the risk, one can't help but wonder why the Overseer ignored Howard's warnings. In fact, it's a question many of the staff will ask themselves in the coming months. A report written by elevated cast member Elaf Carpenter provides a likely explanation. On February 20th, 2000, Carpenter begins an official assessment of Frisk's performance, the catalyst for which being Frisk's inability to turn up significant results since replacing the previous overseer in 1980. This makes him fear for his position. Frisk decides to push forward with the excavation in an attempt to secure his role and buy back favor with the elevated cast, which, for a spell, works. Carpenter's assessment becomes more glowing, commending Frisk for his passion, his efficiency, and commitment to the cause. Things quickly take a turn for the terrifying. As it turns out, the tomb is a resting place for some ancient intelligence that arrived on Earth many millions of years ago. As aeons passed, mankind found many names for it: demon, spirit. The most recent belongs to the Inuit, the indigenous people of Greenland, who worshipped it as the Turngate. The entity itself claims that it lived harmoniously with early humans, providing knowledge and protection. However, this may be a falsehood. The only bit of documentation comes from the Greenland mythology note, which asserts that the entity is malicious in nature, sabotaging tools, turning hunts bad, and even at times possessing the weak and unfortunate. Yet, even this isn't an entirely trustworthy source. The author of the note is a Christian convert who looks scornfully upon the Inuit deities. At the same time, this doesn't mean the Turngate is an entirely benign being. In fact, if the events of the shelter are any indication, its motives are entirely up to debate. Excavating the tomb results with a miasma flowing out from it. The Turngate virus spreads all throughout the facility at an alarming rate. The first symptoms reveal themselves as mild disorientation, but over the course of a few hours, an infected will experience deja vu, paranoia, and auditory distortions. By the 7th hour, the infected will expire. When they get back up, however, is anyone's guess. There are no records of reanimation time. The impure are desiccated and gone, with flesh stretched across eroded muscle and a clearly visible skeleton, yet they are far from mindless. They actually display great intelligence with the ability for speech and subterfuge. Even more fascinating, the impure don't regard each other or themselves as individuals, but appear to operate as one, a singular unit. Howard hypothesizes that the virus is capable of manipulating the host motor neuron functions. Thus, in an attempt to mitigate the infection, Overseer Frisk tasked the shelter's chief biologist, Dr. Richard Eminis, with theorizing ways of controlling it. His conjectures prove quite interesting. For one, he suspects that the infection places self-preservation above the agency of the host, which is why the infected cannot self-terminate. This harkens back to poor Red, who cryptically explained that suicide was against the rules. Secondly, because the virus adapts the organism's brain functions to suit its own purpose, a particularly stubborn consciousness might find itself inadvertently segmented, or more appropriately, partitioned. In layman's, a host might find a small corner of their mind perverted into a secondary personality. This will be relevant shortly. Lastly, the host and the virus may have access to each other's memories, which, considering the age of the virus, may be a substantial collection. This is a microcosm of the concept seen with the persona TARDIS, which also accumulates the memories of those who have come into contact with it. In the months that follow, concern turns to panic. Overseer Frisk reveals himself to be a little less committed to the cause as he flees into the kennels for protection. On the flip side, Carpenter reveals himself to be a lot more committed as he follows after the cowardly Overseer to continue his report. We'll revisit these two later. The surviving members of the staff retreat into the mess hall, converting it into a stronghold. Among them is Howard, who has adopted the unenviable task of closing Pandora's box for himself. Over the course of the next year, he continues his translations, knowing that their only hope for survival lies with him. Contrary to what a certain spider hater once believed, Howard knows that there will be no rescue parties. Even if the Archaic Central Cast cares enough to secure their findings, they will never find them, as all knowledge of the shelter's existence begins and ends in the shelter. Well, mostly. There is still the matter of a safety deposit box. While Philip is following a breadcrumb trail, Howard is lamenting sacrificing family for work. It has brought little good and a lot of horror. Howard finds solace in the thought that the secrets of the shelter shall remain buried. If only he knew that the son he entrusted to bury it was actually digging it up. Either way, Howard's research eventually yields a sliver of hope. His translations hint at the idea of a hive mind resting in the tomb, something which allows the unpure to communicate telepathically, something that communes with them, giving them direction and purpose. Howard likens them to worker bees, implying that they serve this hive mind, but to what end? He believes he can communicate with the Turngate, perhaps bargain with it, and decides to brave the infected parts of the shelter in an attempt to reach the library. Against all odds, Howard eventually makes it and contacts the Turngate. Much to his surprise, the entity is exactly what he predicted, and yet far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. It pulls his consciousness into a strange space, a kind of mental projection of the hive mind, where it imparts awesome mind-shattering knowledge. With his eyes now open, Howard is given a new perspective, a hopeless one, and he retires from his work, going willfully into that good night. 6 months after establishing the stronghold, most of the staff decides to abandon the shelter. They were emboldened into the move by Dr. Roberts, who, as discussed in the previous episode, fled into the mines during the early hours of the outbreak. It should go without saying, they don't get very far. A couple of the survivors return, Dr. Richard Eminis and Dr. Amabel Swanson, and decide to take their chances deeper into shelter. They were eventually separated. The former, Dr. Eminis, seals himself inside the computer center. Swanson, on the other hand, secures herself in her own office. With nothing but time, she gets to work on developing an actual cure. Oh, and the aforementioned Dr. Roberts? We never did get to see what became of him. Let's close the book on that mystery. Around the same time the staff hold themselves up in the mess hall, Overseer Frisk and Elaf Carpenter lock themselves away in the kennels. Carpenter, not realizing the severity of the situation, continues working on his assessment. It seems there are 2 types of people left in the shelter: those who know they were doomed, and those too blind to see it. Sometime in September, Frisk befriends the canines, despite many of them being infected. By October, the Overseer has developed an extreme aversion to light. Like an animal, he digs out some of the walls in order to hide inside them. Even more curious, Carpenter begins to suspect the Overseer of sneaking out of the facility at night. And more troubling, Frisk starts to feed on the canines, despite rations being more than plentiful. The final entry reveals where Carpenter has been sneaking off to: the mines. Carpenter awakens one morning to find a corpse lying on the floor next to him. The corpse of Dr. Roberts, the spider hater, riddled with bite marks, his tongue missing entirely. Frisk, a dark shape in the corner of his vision, flees into the shadows, and Carpenter, a man of commitment to the very end, vows to continue observing him. It is the last vow he ever makes. Which brings us to the beginning of Black Plague, a scant 3 weeks later. Philip, having finally breached the shelter, escapes imprisonment and resumes his search for his father. However, all is not right with him. Philip begins experiencing the symptoms of infection, bouts of deja vu, of mental and oral hallucinations. If there is any doubt in him of the possibility of infection, the sudden manifestation of a voice in his head should make it painfully apparent. Just as Dr. Eminis predicted, the Turngate virus profaned a part of his mind, forming it into a secondary personality, and a particularly surly one at that.
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? What am I doing here? Who am I? Why can't I hear their voices? Well, thanks for the help. I'm having an existential nightmare and you can't even say a word.
Referring to himself as Clarence, a reference to the guardian angel from It's a Wonderful Life, this ghoulish little hitchhiker has a timbre that's part George Carlin, part Mark Hamill's Joker. He often refers to Philip as monkey, taunting him, holding his humanity, his individuality with as much regard as we may hold a cockroach. To Clarence, we primates are inferior to the vast, ancient intelligence that birthed him. Unlike Red, whose mental instability made him an involuntary danger, Clarence is outwardly antagonistic to Philip. As a passenger in his mind, Clarence can affect the way he perceives the world. He occludes Philip's vision, creates hallucinations, induces paranoia. He can even communicate with other impure, as he manages to summon them to attack Philip on more than one occasion, and there is nothing he can do to stop him, at least for now. As he navigates the shelter, Philip stumbles upon a computer in the staff quarters, where he receives a video call from Dr. Swanson. She explains that his father might have found the solution to the infection, but has cloistered himself away in the station's library. Philip, determined to reunite with him at all costs, pushes further into the shelter. He eventually hits a wall. A scanner requiring a handprint identification stands between him and the answers he seeks. Fortunately for Philip, he finds aid in the form of Dr. Eminis. Unfortunately for Philip, the good doctor isn't all there in the head. He claims to have memories of events no man should ever recall, speaking of the moment of his birth down to the zeptosecond and describing his mother's surprised expression as he poked his head into the world for the first time. It's obvious Eminis is infected, which makes Clarence particularly curious. Philip and his surly-voiced hitchhiker are also infected, but seem to operate as an individual with two faces. Dr. Eminis, on the other hand, isn't fractured in the least bit. He communes with the turngate, harmoniously moving in one direction with it, where Clarence and Philip move in opposite ones. Either way, Dr. Eminis offers his hand to Philip, literally, so that he may use it to unlock the door. He requires a means of surgically removing it, recommending Philip bring him a handsaw. He obliges, as does the good doctor. However, as it turns out, Eminis is less than willing to part with the appendage. Now, when impure, he attacks, but Philip manages to lock him inside of a neighboring room. After taking the hand for himself, he unseals the door and resumes his search. After what feels like forever and a day, Philip reaches the library, and the son is reunited with the father. Of course, if you've been reading the writing on the wall, what follows should be of no surprise. In a hidden chamber, Howard's cold, gray-skinned body sits, almost as if waiting for this moment. He is dead by his own hand, and yet was driven to the act by the eldritch knowledge bestowed upon him by the turngate. Philip, in his horror, doesn't find himself shocked, but deflated. He had known it would end this way, somehow, even if he didn't dare admit it. Staring at the decomposing visage of his father, he realizes what a fool's errand he had undertaken, and yet there is still work for this fool to do. Still one last mystery to uncover. Why his father did it. He must first contend with the baggage he picked up on the way here. Clarence. Philip must first rid himself of the turngate infection. Luckily for him, Dr. Swanson believes she has accomplished what Howard could not. She has created a cure. From behind a pair of locked doors, she instructs him to find the key card that will grant him access to her office. Philip's search takes him to the kennels, which has been the abode of Overseer Frisk and Elaf Carpenter for many months. The latter is nowhere to be seen, having likely fled for his safety long ago. Carpenter's fate will be explored later. Overseer Frisk, on the other hand, Philip can hear him crawling around inside the walls. While we never actually get to see what's become of him, he is a very real hazard, stalking Philip from the shadows. Sprinting from light source to light source, he manages to avoid the mutated Frisk, swipe the key card, and return back to Dr. Swanson. However, her office is, ostensibly, empty. After rummaging through her lab, Philip is attacked by an infected. The impure plods after him, but he manages to dispatch of it by dropping a metal crate atop its foul head. Doing so dispels the illusion. A shrill shriek fills the chamber, and Philip's vision goes white. When the world returns, the tragedy is revealed. As it turns out, his pursuer was no infected, but Dr. Amabel Swanson herself. Clarence, in a duplicitous act of self-preservation, tricked Philip into seeing her as an unpure. The hitchhiker taunts Philip, confident that without Dr. Swanson, his existence shall go unthreatened. Except, the doctor had left notes on her computer, instructing Philip on how to produce the antidote himself. Philip begins to gather the components for the formula. All the while, Clarence, now facing his mortality, pleads with him not to go through with it. His words fall on deaf ears. After all, he is a monster. Worse, he is monstrous. So the hitchhiker has to go. With checkmate only one move away, Clarence decides he'd rather destroy the chessboard entirely. He messes with Philip's perception, desperately trying to get him killed. However, his host is stronger than he gives him credit for, and manages to create the antidote. Philip self-administers and expels Clarence from his consciousness. Now without a host, the disembodied Clarence possesses and reanimates the body of a nearby infected corpse. Hungry for vengeance, it gives chase, but is quickly surrounded by other impure, agents of the hive mind who expunge him from the body, killing him. Because Clarence did not move with the Turngate's will, because it possessed an individuality akin to our own, he was destroyed. The Turngate apologizes for his behavior and ushers Philip into the strange space Howard was sent not long ago. Like father, like son, Philip communes with the Turngate and learns the same awesome truths that drove Howard to take his life. The ancient intelligence explains the nature behind the infection, that it was a self-defense mechanism deployed to prevent the Archaic from controlling it, for their intentions were impure. Yet, it does not begrudge Philip. Humanity might be monolithic in its cruelty, but the individual is capable of compassion, of mercy, which the Turngate hopes to inspire in Philip. Fearful of the day more people will arrive, it asks him to destroy all traces of the shelter, to finally do what Howard asked of him 1 year prior. Philip agrees, or so he purports. While the Turngate might not hold a grudge, Philip is but a man. The final scene of Black Plague is the first of Overture, an email from our protagonist to an unknown party, imploring them to come to Greenland and kill them all. Having perpetuated the sins of his father, it seems he has more in common with Clarence than he initially believed. Requiem begins where Black Plague ends, with Philip exhaling a sigh of relief after sending the message. Moments later, however, a snarl creeps up from behind him, and he is knocked unconscious. What follows is a series of trials to a dreamscape conjured up in the hive mind of the Turngate, and he is not alone. There are 3 other psyches found within. One of them is Elaf Carpenter, who attempted suicide via cyanide pill after being imprisoned by one of the infected. Here, confined to the shifting logic of the hive mind, he slowly descends into madness. The next consciousness found within the hive mind is Dr. Eminis, who was bonded with the Turngate and is now a vector for its vast intellect. He possesses knowledge of things beyond mortal ken, speaking of Clarence, of a predetermined universe, and even reveals the number of intelligent species it holds, a heart-stopping 103. Considering this, it should be of no surprise that he is also aware of Philip's email and the promise he broke to the Turngate when he sent the coordinates of the shelter out to that unknown party. The final consciousness he encounters is Red, who, despite not having a pulse, hasn't lost his sense of humor. He chastises Philip for not heeding his warning, but doesn't hold a grudge. To err may be human, but in this strange, abstract space, Red feels pretty close to divine. He knows that he and Philip will either free themselves from the hive mind together, or be condemned to eternal darkness like Elaf Carpenter before them. Rather amusingly, either fate is acceptable to him. Philip eventually finds the exit to the dreamscape. But there are 2 ways out. The first is represented by the very incinerator which reduced Red to cinders a lifetime ago. Except this time, there's room for 2. Philip joins Red for the conflagration, and the 2 shuffle from this immortal coil together. A poetic end, if you ask me. After all, Philip was a slave to curiosity who should have never come to the mines to begin with. Choosing this end is an embracement of his folly, an unspoken acknowledgement of his guilt and the need for expiation. It is also the kinder of the 2. Immolation may be a terrible way to go out, but the momentary pain of seared flesh pales in comparison to the alternative. Death is a mercy. Death is a gift. Don't believe me? Ask Red. The other way out is to turn your back on the incinerator, essentially rejecting your part in prolonging the horror. Walking through the door takes Philip back to the ship from the beginning of Overture, where he is condemned to live through the experiences over and over again, until the sun swells in size and swallows the earth whole, likely. It is a cruel ending, but perhaps the more fitting. He did betray the Turngate, who, based on the evidence provided in-game, was only defending itself. Whoever Philip contacted will receive the email, and whether they retaliate is a story reserved for headcanon. As for which ending is canonical, that's up to you. While exploring the hive mind, Dr. Eminis remarks that Philip's death is imminent, a byproduct of his knowledge of a predetermined universe. So, no matter what, both conclusions can be true. Regardless of your choice, Philip is a doomed man, and I suppose he wouldn't have it any other way. In Philip's own words, better to make your own mistakes than feed off someone else's triumphs. Better to choose hell than to be assigned to heaven. Thanks for watching. Whitecoats lie dead under the linoleum. Pained wails and feral snarls echo behind locked doors. Whitecoats lie dead under the...